You will treat this family with respect, old man, or you will get out." The words, sharp and cold, sliced through the quiet afternoon air of the home I had built. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, stood with her arms crossed, a posture of belligerent authority she had adopted as her own. Her husband, my son David, stood just behind her, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder, a portrait of spineless complicity. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He never did when she was like this. I looked from her face, contorted with a sense of righteous indignation, to my son's averted gaze, and then back to her. I held a bag of groceries in each hand, the paper sacks crinkling with the slight tremor that had started in my fingers. I had just returned from my weekly shopping run, a task I had taken upon myself years ago. I bought the food, I cooked the meals, I paid the mortgage on this house, the utilities that kept it warm in the winter and cool in the summer. This was my home, or so I had thought. The conflict had started over something laughably trivial. Jessica had demanded I go back to the store, a 40-minute round trip, because I had purchased the wrong brand of organic, gluten-free, artisanal crackers. Not a request, but a demand, delivered with a sneer as she lounged on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. For the first time in a very long time, I had simply said, no. That single word had detonated a bomb of resentment that had clearly been festering for years. My quiet refusal was not seen as a reasonable boundary, but as an act of rebellion, an act of disrespect. The argument, if one could call her shrieking monologue an argument, escalated with breathtaking speed. It moved from crackers to my general uselessness, my dated opinions, my constant hovering presence. I was a burden, a relic, a servant who had forgotten his place. And now, the ultimatum. It hung in the air between us, crystalline and ugly, subservience or exile. My son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose college tuition I had paid in full, whose wedding I had financed, remained silent. His silence was his answer. It was his endorsement. He had made his choice. A strange sense of calm washed over me, extinguishing the flicker of anger and the deep, aching hurt. The tremors in my hands stopped. The years of quiet enablement, of biting my tongue for the sake of a fragile peace, of funding a lifestyle they felt entitled to, coalesced into a single moment of perfect, unassailable clarity. They saw me as a utility, a resource to be drained, and now the utility was malfunctioning. I looked at Jessica, at her smug, expectant face, and I did something she did not expect. I smiled. It wasn't a large smile, just a small, sad turning of my lips. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a key, not a sentence. "I see," I said, my voice even. I placed the grocery bags gently on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not plead my case or list my decades of contributions. They wouldn't have heard it anyway. Their world was too small, too loud with their own wants. "I'll pack." The surprise on her face was a fleeting, satisfying thing. She had expected a fight, tears, a pathetic plea. She had wanted to see me broken. My quiet acquiescence disarmed her. David finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of shock and, perhaps, a tiny flicker of shame. It was too little, far too late. I turned without another word and walked up the stairs to my room. It was the master bedroom, though I hadn't felt like the master of this house in years. My footsteps were steady on the oak staircase I had helped install 30 years ago with my wife, Martha. Her photograph was on my nightstand, her warm, intelligent eyes the first thing I saw every morning and the last thing I saw every night. I didn't pack much. There was no need. My life, the one that mattered, was not contained in closets full of clothes or shelves full of books. I took a single, sturdy suitcase from the top of the wardrobe. I laid out 3 sets of clothes, simple, practical things. I packed my toiletries, my reading glasses, and the worn, leather-bound journal I'd kept since Martha passed. Then, I went to the small safe hidden in the back of the closet. Inside was not cash, but documents. My birth certificate, my military service records, my passport. The deed to this house, with my name, and my name alone, on it. My wife's death certificate, and a thick folder containing decades of financial records, bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns, the tangible proof of a life of discipline and responsibility. I placed the folder at the bottom of the suitcase. Finally, I took the silver-framed photograph of Martha. I wrapped it carefully in a wool sweater and placed it on top of everything else. I zipped the suitcase. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. When I walked back down the stairs, suitcase in hand, they were still in the foyer, standing amidst the groceries I had bought. They looked like statues in a museum of domestic strife. Jessica's expression had shifted from triumph to confusion. This was not following her script. "That's it?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "You're just leaving?" "You gave me a choice," I replied calmly, walking toward the front door. "I am honoring your wishes." David took a half-step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak. "Dad, wait." I paused with my hand on the doorknob, but I did not turn to look at him. "Goodbye, David." I opened the door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and closed it softly behind me. I did not slam it. I did not look back. I walked down the stone path I had laid with my own hands, past the rose bushes Martha had planted, and got into my car. It was a modest sedan, 10 years old, but meticulously maintained. Paid for, like everything else. As I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself one glance in the rearview mirror. The front door remained closed. The lights inside looked warm and inviting, a perfect picture of a happy home, a perfect lie. The drive away from the house was a journey through memory. Every street corner, every landmark, held a ghost of the past. There was the park where I taught David to ride a bicycle, his small, triumphant face beaming as he finally found his balance. There was the high school from which he graduated, my chest swelling with a pride that felt boundless. There was the small chapel where he married Jessica, a lavish affair I had paid for, convincing myself that her expensive tastes were a sign of ambition, not avarice. With each mile that separated me from the house, the weight on my shoulders seemed to lighten. For years, I had been operating under the mistaken belief that I was preserving a family. I see now I was merely funding a parasitic relationship. My love for my son, and my lingering grief for my wife, had blinded me to the reality of the situation. I had made excuses for David's lack of drive, for Jessica's blatant materialism. I had told myself they were young, that they would mature. I was wrong. They had not matured. They had simply grown more comfortable in their dependency. My mind, trained by 40 years as a forensic accountant, began to do what it does best: catalog, organize, and analyze. The numbers scrolled through my head, a silent testament to the depth of my long-term investment in their lives. I paid for David's 4-year business degree, a sum exceeding $100,000. He had never held a job in that field for more than 6 months. I paid for their wedding, a spectacle costing nearly $50,000, because Jessica insisted her special day required it. I gave them the $60,000 down payment for the house, the very house I was now exiled from, putting it in my name for tax purposes, with the verbal agreement that they would eventually take over the mortgage. They never had. For the past 7 years, I had paid the monthly mortgage payment of $2,200. That was $184,800. I paid the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance. I paid for the new roof 2 years ago, the new water heater last winter. My pension and Social Security checks were deposited directly into the joint account from which all these household bills were paid, an account to which they both had full access, an account I now realized they treated as an infinite source of personal funding for dinners out, new clothes, and weekend trips I was never invited on. The sacrifices weren't just financial. I sacrificed my peace. I sacrificed my dignity. I sacrificed my right to have a voice in my own home. I did it all under the guise of love, for the sake of family harmony. But it wasn't harmony. It was appeasement. And appeasement only ever emboldens the aggressor. Jessica's ultimatum was not the beginning of the problem. It was merely the loud, ugly culmination of 1,000 smaller concessions, 1,000 moments where I chose to be silent rather than confront the creeping rot of entitlement. Her words were a gift. They had severed the final thread of my delusion. Instead of driving aimlessly, I had a destination. I drove for an hour, leaving the familiar suburbs behind and heading toward the older, more industrial side of the city. I pulled into the parking lot of a clean but unremarkable motel, the kind that caters to business travelers and families on a budget. The Starlight Inn sign hummed with a quiet neon buzz. It was anonymous. It was perfect. I paid for a week in cash, using the emergency fund I always kept separate, a habit from my leaner years. The room was sterile, impersonal. Beige walls, a firm bed, a small desk, and a television bolted to the wall. It had none of the history or warmth of the house I had left, and for that, I was grateful. This was not a home. It was a base of operations, a command center, the place where my old life ended and my new one began. I placed the suitcase on the luggage rack and opened it. The first thing I took out was the picture of Martha. I set it on the small nightstand. Her smile seemed to offer encouragement, a silent affirmation. "It's about time, Frank," I could almost hear her say, her voice a mix of exasperation and love. She had always seen people for who they were, a clarity I had apparently lost after she was gone. I sat down at the small desk, took out my phone, a pen, and the notepad provided by the motel. I opened the thick folder of financial documents. The fluorescent light of the room cast a flat, revealing glare on the papers. For the next hour, I did not grieve. I did not rage. I planned. I made a list, neat and methodical. Each item was a financial artery connecting me to David and Jessica. My task was simple: to sever each one, cleanly and irrevocably. The time for quiet enablement was over. The time for empowered self-preservation had begun. My response to their ultimatum would not be an emotional outburst. It would be a series of precise, calculated, and legally sound actions. They wanted me out of their lives. I was about to grant their wish in ways they could not possibly imagine. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The unfamiliar mattress had left my back stiff, but my mind was sharp. I made a cup of the terrible in-room coffee, the bitter taste a welcome jolt to my senses. I sat at the desk, Martha's picture watching over me, and looked at the list I had prepared the night before. It was time to begin. The campaign started at precisely 9 a.m., when the banks on the East Coast opened for business. My first call was to the bank that held the mortgage on the house. I had been a customer there for over 30 years. After navigating the automated menu and providing my credentials, I was connected to a cheerful representative named Susan. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. How can I help you today?" "Good morning, Susan," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I need to make a change to my mortgage account. Number 74-Alpha 33-Beta. I would like to cancel all future automatic payments from my checking account, effective immediately." There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "Okay, I can certainly do that for you, sir." "Can I ask the reason for the cancellation?" "I am restructuring my finances," I said simply. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. "All right, Mr. Miller. I have canceled the autopay feature. Your next payment will be due on the 1st of the month and will need to be made manually. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "Yes, one more thing. Can you please confirm the mailing address on record for all correspondence regarding this mortgage?" I read back the address of the house. She confirmed it was correct. "Excellent. Thank you for your help." Susan, one line item on my list was crossed off. The first artery was severed. The next foreclosure notice would be delivered directly to David and Jessica. It would be their problem to solve, not mine. My second call was to my auto insurance company. My policy covered my sedan, as well as the expensive SUV that Jessica drove. A vehicle that was, of course, registered in my name to secure a lower interest rate on the loan. A loan I had co-signed and had been making payments on for the last 2 years. "I need to make some changes to my policy," I told the agent. "I would like to remove 2 drivers and 1 vehicle. The drivers are David Miller and Jessica Miller. The vehicle is the 2021 Ford Explorer." "Okay, sir, I can process that. This will significantly lower your premium," the agent noted helpfully. "I'm aware," I said. "Please make the changes effective immediately and email me the updated policy documents." Within minutes, an email pinged on my phone. The SUV was no longer insured. Driving it would now be illegal. Another line crossed off my list. They would discover this problem the next time they were pulled over, or more likely, when the notice from the State Department of Motor Vehicles arrived. The third call was the most significant. It was to the credit card company. I had 3 cards with them. One was mine alone. The other 2 were joint accounts, with David and Jessica listed as authorized users. They each had a card with their name on it, but the ultimate responsibility for the debt was mine. For years, I had watched their balances climb with charges for things I could never afford for myself. Designer clothes, spa days, expensive electronics. I had paid the minimums, sometimes more, telling myself it was a safety net for them. It wasn't a safety net. It was a shopping spree with no consequences. "I am calling to report 2 of my cards as lost and to have them canceled," I told the fraud department. This was a strategic choice. Simply removing them as authorized users might take a day or 2 to process. Reporting the cards as lost would deactivate them instantly. I would also like to revoke authorized user status for David Miller and Jessica Miller on my account permanently. "I understand, sir. We will cancel those cards immediately. New cards with new numbers will be sent to your mailing address." "About that," I said. "I need to update my mailing address." I gave them the address of a new post office box I had rented that morning. All my financial correspondence would now be rerouted, invisible, and inaccessible to them. The final call of the morning was to my financial advisor, a sharp woman named Sarah who had taken over my account after my old advisor retired. I had already scheduled the appointment the day before. "Frank, Good to hear from you, she said. Everything all right? Everything is changing, Sarah, I said. I need to make some immediate and significant adjustments to my estate plan. Specifically, my will and the beneficiaries on my life insurance policy and investment accounts. There was a brief, professional silence on her end. I see. Who are the current beneficiaries? My son, David Miller, is the primary beneficiary on everything. I want that changed. I want him removed entirely. Frank, this is a major decision. Are you sure you want to proceed? I have never been more sure of anything in my life, I said, and the conviction in my own voice surprised me. I want the new beneficiary to be the Martha Miller Memorial Scholarship Fund, which I would like you to help me establish. It will provide grants to underprivileged students pursuing degrees in accounting at the local community college. I could hear the smile in her voice. Frank, that's a wonderful idea. A beautiful way to honor Martha's memory. She always valued education. I'll draft the paperwork immediately. By lunchtime, it was done. In the span of 3 hours, I had systematically dismantled the entire financial support structure that had enabled my son and his wife for nearly a decade. I had cut the ropes, burned the bridges, and sealed the exits. I had not acted out of anger or a desire for petty revenge. I had acted as a surgeon removing a cancer. It was a painful but necessary procedure, performed with precision and a clear objective: my own survival. I sat back in the stiff motel chair and looked at my phone. It was silent. For now, they wouldn't have noticed anything yet. Jessica might be at the gym, David at his part-time job that barely covered his gas money. Their world was still turning as it always had, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just vanished. The first inkling they had that something was wrong came later that afternoon. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet, began to buzz. A call from Jessica. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again. David. I ignored that one too. Then came the text messages. The first was from Jessica. My credit card was just declined at the salon. Fix it. No, hello, no, please. Just a command. The entitlement was so ingrained, she couldn't even fathom a world where her demands were not met instantly. Another text, from David, moments later. Dad, Jess is having trouble with her card. Did you forget to pay the bill? Call me. The assumption, as always, was that I had made a mistake, that I had failed in my duty to provide for them. The possibility that I had acted deliberately was, at this point, completely beyond their comprehension. I didn't respond. I sat and watched the phone as a cascade of missed calls and increasingly frantic texts began to pour in. They became a sort of real-time log of their dawning horror. Jessica. David's card isn't working either. What is going on? Did you cancel them? You can't do that. David. Dad, please pick up. This isn't funny. Jessica is freaking out. We need to buy groceries. The irony of that last message was not lost on me. The groceries I had bought the day before were likely still sitting in their bags on the foyer floor, a monument to the conflict that had started this all. The calls and texts continued sporadically throughout the evening and into the next day. I documented each one in my journal, noting the time and the message. It was a fascinating study in psychological unraveling. Their tone shifted from arrogant and demanding to confused and annoyed, then to pleading, and finally to outright panic. The real crisis for them, I knew, would begin on the 1st of the month, still a few days away. That's when the mortgage payment would fail to automatically debit. It would be followed by a polite but firm letter from the bank. Then, a few weeks later, a more serious letter. Then the phone calls would start. Foreclosure is a slow, bureaucratic process, but it is relentless. A few days after I had left, I knew they would be desperate. Their supply of ready cash, which mostly came from their credit cards and the joint account I had since emptied and closed, would be gone. They had never learned to budget or save because they had never needed to. I was their budget. I was their savings account. The anticipated confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon. I was returning to my motel room with a book from the local library when I saw the ostentatious SUV parked near my door. It was unmistakable. They had found me. I wasn't surprised. A simple charge on my personal credit card for the motel room, made before I had all my new systems in place, was likely the breadcrumb that led them here. Jessica got out of the passenger side as I approached. Her face was a mask of fury. David emerged from the driver's side, looking haggard and lost. "There you are!" Jessica screeched, pointing a finger at me. "What do you think you're doing? Hiding out in this disgusting motel? You shut off our cards. You took us off the insurance. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" I stopped a few feet away, holding my library book. I kept my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. I did not engage with her rage. "Hello, Jessica." "David," I said, my voice even. "Don't you, 'Hello, Jessica' me," she spat. "You turn everything back on, right now. We have bills to pay. I have appointments. This little tantrum of yours is over." David stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Dad, come on. We were worried. Let's talk about this. I think we all said things we didn't mean." The emotional appeal. The classic tactic of the complicit. He was trying to rewrite history, to frame their ultimatum as a simple misunderstanding, a heat-of-the-moment spat. He wanted to smooth things over, to return to the comfortable status quo where he didn't have to take responsibility for anything. I looked directly at my son, past Jessica's simmering rage. "I remember very clearly what was said, David. There was no misunderstanding. I was given a choice." I then turned my gaze to Jessica. "You told me to treat the family with respect or get out. You defined respect as immediate obedience to your whims, like fetching a different brand of crackers. You saw my role as that of a servant, and when I refused that role, you presented the alternative: exile. Those were your terms, not mine." Jessica's face flushed with color. Hearing her own ugly words repeated back to her so calmly and factually in the middle of a motel parking lot seemed to momentarily stun her. I was upset," she stammered, falling back on the excuse of emotional incontinence. "You were being difficult. You can't just abandon your family because of one little argument." "This wasn't about one argument," I said, my voice still quiet, yet carrying a weight that cut through her hysteria. "This was about a pattern of behavior that I have enabled for far too long. The credit cards, the car, the house, the bills, all of it was part of a system that you took for granted. That system is now permanently dismantled." "You can't do that," she insisted, her voice rising again. "It's illegal. We have rights." "On the contrary," I replied, shifting the library book to my other hand. "Everything I have done is perfectly legal. The house is in my name. The car is in my name. The credit accounts were in my name. I was the primary account holder. You were dependents. I have simply chosen to end that dependency. You are both adults. It is time you started acting like it." David looked utterly defeated. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. There would be no easy fix. The bank of Dad was closed, its assets liquidated. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are we supposed to do?" It was the question of a child, not a man. For a moment, a pang of the old paternal instinct flared within me, the urge to fix it, to make it better, to spare him the pain of his own poor choices. I suppressed it ruthlessly. More help now would not be an act of love. It would be an act of sabotage against any potential for his growth. That is for you and your wife to figure out, I said, my tone softening slightly, but my resolve unshaken. You wanted me out of your life. I am respecting your wishes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a book to read. I walked past them, unlocked the door to my room, and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind me. I did not look back to see their reactions. I leaned against the door for a long moment, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly receding. There was no triumph, no joy, just a profound and hollow sadness for the son I had lost, and a quiet, steely determination to see this through to its logical conclusion. The first confrontation was over. I knew, with absolute certainty, it would not be the last. The days following the confrontation in the motel parking lot settled into a new, quiet rhythm. I spent my time at the library, not just reading for pleasure, but for purpose. I researched local charities, looking for a worthy cause to be the ultimate beneficiary of my life's work. I established my new, independent life with the same methodical precision I had used to dismantle the old one. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, arranged for my pension to be deposited there, and set a modest but comfortable budget for myself. The sense of freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I was the sole captain of my own ship. Meanwhile, the storm I had unleashed upon David and Jessica was gathering force. While I had severed the direct financial lifelines, the secondary consequences were now beginning to ripple outward. The first official letter from the bank regarding the missed mortgage payment would have arrived. The notice from the Department of Motor Vehicles about the lapse in insurance on the SUV would be on its way. The silence from my end, my complete and total unreachability, must have been maddening for them. The next phase of my strategy required information. I needed to understand the full scope of their financial situation, not just the parts I had been funding. A chance encounter provided the breakthrough I needed. I was having lunch at a small diner I'd discovered near the library when a man at a nearby table looked up and his eyes widened in recognition. "Frank Miller? Is that you?" It was Mark Renshaw, a man who had worked under me in the risk assessment department at the bank for nearly 15 years before I retired. He was a good man, sharp and principled. "Mark, it's great to see you," I said, genuinely pleased. We shook hands, and I invited him to join me. We spent a few minutes catching up on old colleagues and the changes at the bank. "It's funny running into you," Mark said, stirring his coffee. "Your name actually came across my desk just last week. A bit of a strange one, actually, my senses sharpened." "Oh?" "I'm retired, Mark. I shouldn't be making waves at the old office." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "It was a loan application. A home equity line of credit? On your property? The application was in your son's name, David. But the signatures, they looked off. The one for you, Frank. It didn't match the signature card we have on file. Not even close. Plus, the income statements he provided for his own employment were, let's just say, creatively written. It had more red flags than a May Day parade. We kicked it back immediately, of course. Figured it was some kind of identity theft attempt. A cold knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't just about entitlement anymore. This was fraud, criminality. My son, or more likely Jessica pushing my son, had attempted to forge my signature to steal the equity from my home. The home they were living in, rent-free. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice level, "you've been a great help. Could you do me a favor, as an old friend? Could you send me a non-official copy of that application packet? To a private email address." He hesitated for a moment, the banker in him warring with the friend. "It's against policy, Frank." "I know," I said, "but I have a feeling I'm going to need it. Something is very wrong, and I need to protect myself." He studied my face, saw the gravity in my eyes, and nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." The next morning, the PDF was in my inbox. The forgery was laughably amateurish, but the documents also contained other gems. They had grossly inflated David's income from his part-time retail job, and they had failed to disclose a number of significant debts. It was a complete work of fiction. Armed with this new, explosive information, I decided it was time to dig deeper. My years as a forensic accountant had taught me that people's financial lives tell a story. I still had access to old credit monitoring services I had used professionally. I ran a background check on my son and daughter-in-law, something I should have done years ago. David's report was what I expected. A thin file, no significant credit of his own, mostly tied to me. Jessica's was another story entirely. It was a disaster. There were multiple credit cards I knew nothing about, all maxed out. There were defaults on several store credit lines. And then I found the real problem: a series of short-term, high-interest online loans. Payday loans, the kind people only take when they are absolutely desperate. The kind of debt that spirals out of control with terrifying speed. Why the desperation for cash? The loan application had been for $50,000. What did they need that money for so urgently? My mind started connecting the dots. The secrecy, the constant need for more money than their lifestyle, even the inflated one I funded, should require. It smelled of a hidden drain, a financial black hole. I hired a private investigator, an old contact I trusted, giving him a simple task: a lifestyle and financial audit of Jessica Miller. It took him less than a week. The report he delivered was even worse than I had imagined. Jessica had a severe and very secret online gambling habit. She spent hours every day on virtual slot machines and poker sites. She was chasing losses, borrowing from predatory lenders to fund her addiction, and had dug a hole so deep she saw my home's equity as her only way out. The fraudulent loan wasn't for a new car or a vacation. It was to pay off vicious loan sharks who were likely growing impatient. This changed everything. My problem wasn't a spoiled daughter-in-law and a weak-willed son. My problem was a desperate, addicted fraudster and her enabling husband, who were not only willing to exploit me, but to commit serious crimes to do so. They hadn't just pushed me out of my home. They had been actively planning to steal it from under me. My lawyer, a pragmatic and no-nonsense man named Bill, had been a friend for years. I laid out the entire story for him in his office, concluding with the loan application and the investigator's report. He listened patiently, his expression growing more grim with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Frank, this is far beyond a family dispute. This is attempted felony fraud. What they've done is serious. You have every right to go to the police." I shook my head. "Not yet. The criminal system is a blunt instrument. I want to handle this my way. For now, I want to focus on the property." "All right," he said, leaning forward. "Then your course of action is clear. We need to move from a soft eviction, which is what you've done by cutting off the mortgage payments, to a hard, legal one. We will serve them with a formal, notarized eviction notice, It will give them 30 days to vacate the premises. If they fail to comply, we can have the sheriff remove them." He paused, then added, "Frank, I also think you need to start controlling the narrative. People in your community, your friends, your neighbors, they are going to hear a very different version of this story from David and Jessica. A story where you are a confused, vindictive old man who abandoned his loving family. You need to get ahead of that." He was right. Jessica was a manipulator. She would paint herself as the victim. I needed the truth to be the first thing people heard, delivered calmly and factually by me. That weekend, I began my quiet campaign of information warfare. I called my next-door neighbor of 25 years, a kind woman named Carol. I met with the pastor of the church Martha and I had attended for decades. I had coffee with a few old friends from my breakfast club. To each of them, I told the same unvarnished story. I started with the ultimatum over the crackers. I explained the years of financial support. I told them about the credit cards being shut off and the mortgage payments being stopped. I explained that I had asked them to leave my home so I could sell it. I presented it not as a drama, but as a series of unfortunate business decisions that had come to a head. I was calm. I was factual. I showed no anger, only a deep, weary sadness. I did not, however, reveal the gambling or the attempted fraud. Those were my aces in the hole, to be played only when absolutely necessary. For now, the simple, provable truth was enough. My reputation in the community was solid, built on a lifetime of integrity. Theirs was not. The seeds of truth, planted in fertile ground, began to grow. The formal eviction notice was served by a process server the following Tuesday. It was a legal declaration of war. Their 30-day grace period had begun. The response was immediate and predictable, a barrage of hysterical, threatening voicemails from Jessica, a string of pleading, pathetic texts from David. I saved them all. They were evidence. But then their tactics shifted. They launched the counterattack my lawyer had predicted. The smear campaign began. Carol, my neighbor, called me a few days later, her voice full of concern. "Frank, I thought you should know. Jessica came over here yesterday in tears. She told me you're having some kind of breakdown, that you've become paranoid, and that you're suffering from memory loss. She said you're a danger to yourself, and that they are trying to get you help, but you ran away from home." So that was the new narrative. I was not a wronged father, but a senile old man. It was a classic and vicious tactic. They were trying to discredit me, to paint me as an unreliable narrator of my own life. The next escalation came from David. He left a voicemail, his voice thick with a cloying, false sincerity. "Dad, we need to talk. There's something you should know. Jessica, she's pregnant. We're going to have a baby, your grandchild. Don't you want to be a part of your grandchild's life? We can fix this, all of it, for the baby. Just come home, the pregnancy. The ultimate emotional weapon. A child, a grandchild, used as a bargaining chip. A pawn in their desperate game. For a moment, the news sent a jolt through me. A grandchild. It was something I had always hoped for. But the timing was too perfect. The deployment of the information too strategic. It felt less like a joyful announcement and more like a hostage negotiation. Was it even true? With Jessica, I couldn't be sure. Even if it was, what kind of life would that child have? Raised by a compulsive gambler and a man with no backbone. A life funded by theft and deceit. Number. A child could not be the glue that patched this brokenness. It would only be another victim of it. My resolve hardened. This changed nothing. In fact, it made my actions even more necessary. I had to ensure that my assets, my legacy, would not be devoured by their dysfunction, but would instead be used for good. The 30-day eviction period was drawing to a close, and their desperation was reaching a fever pitch. I knew they would attempt a final, public appeal. My lawyer's advice echoed in my mind. Control the narrative. It was time to play my aces. The opportunity presented itself the following Sunday. My old church held a community potluck after the service, a tradition stretching back decades. I knew David and Jessica would be there. They weren't religious, but in a crisis, they would perform religiosity for the sake of appearances. They would work the room, spreading their tale of woe about their confused, ailing father. I decided it was the perfect venue for a public showdown. I arrived late, slipping into the crowded fellowship hall as the meal was in full swing. I spotted them immediately. Jessica was holding court at a large table, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, while several sympathetic church ladies patted her arm. David stood beside her, looking miserable, nodding along to her performance. She was playing the part of the devoted, worried daughter-in-law to perfection. I filled a plate, found a seat at a table with some old friends, and waited. I ate slowly, calmly, greeting people who stopped by to say hello. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, could sense the whispers. They were comparing the reality of my presence, calm, lucid, well-dressed, with the fiction Jessica was peddling. The cognitive dissonance was already working in my favor. Finally, after about 20 minutes, Jessica saw me. Her eyes widened, and a flash of anger crossed her face before she quickly replaced it with a look of pained concern. She stood up and walked toward me, David trailing in her wake like a dinghy behind a battleship. "Dad," she said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. We've been so worried. Please come home. We can get you the help you need." The entire hall went quiet. Everyone was watching. This was it. The stage was set. I slowly finished chewing a bite of potato salad, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and looked up at her. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. "Jessica, there is nothing wrong with my health, mental or otherwise, and you know it," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Telling these good people that I am senile is a cruel and dishonest tactic." A gasp went through the room. Jessica's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "We're just concerned." "Are you?" I asked, my gaze unwavering. "Were you concerned for my well-being when you and David tried to take out a $50,000 line of credit on my house by forging my signature? I have a copy of the loan application, if anyone would like to see it." The bank flagged it as fraud. The silence in the hall was now absolute, thick with shock. Jessica looked as if I had physically struck her. David's face went from pale to ghostly white. I wasn't finished. I turned my attention to the wider audience, my voice ringing with the clarity of undeniable truth. For 7 years, I have paid every single bill for that house. The mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the utilities. I gave them a home, and in return, they gave me an ultimatum. Be their servant or be homeless. I chose to leave the home I own. I then looked directly at Jessica again, my voice softening with a cold, surgical precision. "I also know about the online gambling, Jessica. I know about the payday loans. I know you're in debt for tens of thousands of dollars. The fraudulent loan wasn't for home repairs, was it? It was to pay off your gambling debts." Jessica swayed on her feet, her hand flying to her mouth. David looked at her, his expression a horrified mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension. It was clear he hadn't known the full extent of her deception either. He had been a pawn, just as I had been. A more willing pawn, perhaps, but a pawn nonetheless. That's a lie, she whispered, but the denial was weak, pathetic. No one believed her. The truth, once revealed, has a power that lies can never match. I stood up slowly, my plate still in my hand. The eviction notice stands. You have 3 days to vacate my property. After that, the sheriff will escort you out. I placed my plate on a nearby table and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me as if I were Moses and they the Red Sea. I had said my piece. I had presented the facts. I had controlled the narrative. As I walked out of the fellowship hall and into the bright afternoon sun, I felt no elation, only a grim sense of necessity. The public demolition was complete. All that was left was the fallout. The aftermath of the public confrontation was swift and brutal. The community, which had been a well of sympathy for Jessica, turned on her overnight. The story of the attempted fraud and the gambling addiction spread like wildfire. Friends stopped returning their calls. The church ladies who had been patting her arm now crossed the street to avoid her. Public opinion, once her greatest weapon, had become her executioner. The day after the potluck, I received a series of increasingly desperate and then threatening voicemails from an unknown number, which I correctly assumed belonged to Jessica. The mask of the concerned daughter-in-law had been incinerated, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath. She threatened lawsuits. She threatened to go to the papers with more lies. She threatened to ruin me. I took the recordings, along with the security footage from the motel of our first confrontation and a detailed log of her harassing calls, to my lawyer. Within 24 hours, we had filed for and been granted a temporary restraining order against her. She was legally barred from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of me, my car, or my current residence. Any violation would result in her immediate arrest. The final legal shield was in place. I was protected. The eviction deadline came and went. As promised, the sheriff's department arrived at the house on the 31st day. According to my neighbor Carol, who gave me a full report over the phone, it was a pathetic spectacle. They hadn't packed a single box, seemingly believing until the very last moment that I would relent. The deputies gave them 1 hour to gather their personal belongings and vacate. Jessica apparently screamed and wept, while David simply stood on the lawn, a vacant expression on his face as their possessions were piled into a few trash bags. The locks were changed, and a no trespassing sign was posted on the lawn. The house was mine once more. Their collapse was total. The SUV was repossessed from the street a few days later. Without a job that could support his lifestyle, and with a credit history now inextricably linked to Jessica's financial ruin, David was unemployable for anything beyond minimum wage. Word on the community grapevine was that Jessica's parents, who lived 2 states away and had long disapproved of David, refused to help them. They were homeless, jobless, and friendless, adrift in a sea of their own making. A week later, I received a letter. It was not from Jessica, but from David. It had been slipped under the door of my motel room, a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the restraining order which only named his wife. His handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. It was not a letter of anger or accusation. It was a letter of complete and utter surrender. He apologized for his weakness, for his silence, for his complicity. He admitted he had been blinded by Jessica, that he had failed me as a son. He confessed that he had not known about the extent of the gambling, But he admitted that it didn't excuse his behavior. He didn't ask for money or for the house back. He asked for one thing: a chance to talk. He said he had left Jessica and was staying on a friend's sofa. I read the letter several times. My first instinct was to tear it up. The hurt was still too raw, the betrayal too deep. But as I sat with it, I saw not the man who had stood silently by as his wife exiled me, but the boy I had raised. A weak boy, a foolish boy, but my son nonetheless. Forgiveness was not yet on the table, but the possibility of a final, clarifying conversation was. I agreed to meet him, not at my motel, but on neutral ground, a quiet park bench overlooking a duck pond. When he arrived, I was shocked by his appearance. He had lost weight, and his eyes were hollowed out, dark with exhaustion and shame. He looked older, broken. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the ducks. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. "I know there's nothing I can say to fix what I've done, Dad." "You're right," I said, not unkindly. "There isn't. I need to understand," he said, looking at his hands. "Why did you do it all? The public confrontation, the eviction. Why so completely?" I turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time in years, because a partial solution wouldn't have worked, David. For years, I applied bandages to a festering wound. I enabled you, and I enabled her. I mistook financial support for love, and I mistook your compliance for respect. The wound was poisoned by lies and entitlement. The only way to save the patient, in this case myself, was to amputate. Radically and completely. It wasn't about punishing you, it was about saving myself. He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. She was never pregnant, was she?" "No," I said softly. "She was not." He let out a shuddering breath, a sound of profound heartbreak. The final manipulation, the most sacred lie now exposed. "What do I do now?" he whispered. This was the crucial moment. He was asking for guidance, not a handout. It was the first adult question he had asked me in a decade. I had a final offer to make, not of reconciliation, but of a potential path toward it. A path he would have to walk alone. "What you do now," I began, choosing my words with care, "is you take responsibility. Not just to me in private, but to everyone you've been a part of deceiving. Your weakness allowed her lies to flourish. Your silence gave them power. If you ever want a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance, at rebuilding any kind of relationship with me, you will have to earn it. And it starts with the truth." "What do you mean?" "I mean a full public confession and apology. I want you to stand up in that same church, in front of that same community, and tell them everything. Tell them how you stood by while I supported you. Tell them how you allowed Jessica to manipulate the situation. Tell them you knew about the ultimatum and did nothing. You will take ownership of your part in this, without excuse or blame. You will validate my story and obliterate any lingering doubt anyone might have." He looked horrified. "Dad, I can't. The humiliation." "It will be deeply humiliating," I agreed. "It is meant to be. It is the price of atonement. True remorse is not a private feeling. It is a public act of repair. It is the only way to demonstrate that you understand the depth of the damage you have caused." I stood up from the bench. "There is one more thing you need to know, so that your decision is not motivated by the wrong reasons. I am finalizing the paperwork this week to donate the house. It will be given, free and clear, to a charitable organization that provides transitional housing for homeless veterans. There is no inheritance, David. There is no property for you to gain. The house is gone. The money is gone. All that is left between us is the truth. You can either embrace it or you can walk away from it. The choice, as always, is yours. I left him there on the bench to grapple with his decision. I had offered him the hardest road imaginable, a road paved with shame and public contrition. But it was the only road that led anywhere meaningful. I did not know what he would choose. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. Whatever he decided, it would no longer have the power to destroy me. The following Sunday, I went to church. I wasn't sure if David would be there, if he would follow through on the Herculean task I had set for him. A part of me expected him to choose the easier path, to disappear and avoid the public humiliation. I would have been disappointed, but not surprised. I took my usual seat in the back pew. The service began, the familiar hymns and prayers washing over me. As the pastor was finishing his sermon, he paused and looked out over the congregation. Before our final hymn, one of our members, David Miller, has asked to say a few words. A ripple of murmurs went through the church. My heart began to beat a little faster. And then I saw him, walking from a side aisle toward the lectern at the front. He was wearing a simple, clean suit that looked a little too big for him now. His hands were trembling, and he clutched a single sheet of paper. He stepped up to the microphone, took a deep, shaky breath, and looked out at the faces staring back at him. His eyes found mine in the back of the church for just a second, and in them I saw not weakness, but a terrifying, newfound strength. "Good morning," he began, his voice cracking slightly before finding its resolve. "My name is David Miller, and I am here today to make a public confession and an apology. For years, many of you have known me as Frank Miller's son. You have seen my father as a good, honorable man. You were right, and I have failed him in every way a son can. The silence in the sanctuary was absolute. For the last 7 years," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "my wife and I lived in my father's house. We did not pay the mortgage. We did not pay the bills. He supported us, completely. We repaid his generosity not with gratitude, but with a growing sense of entitlement. We saw his kindness as an obligation. We treated him not as a father, but as a functionary, an employee in his own home." He paused, swallowing hard. "A few weeks ago, my wife gave my father an ultimatum, and I stood by and let it happen. She told him that if he would not submit to our demands, he had to leave his own home. He did not argue. He just packed a bag and left. What he did next, cutting us off financially, was not an act of cruelty, as we tried to make you all believe. It was an act of self-preservation, forced upon him by us. I am here to tell you that every word my father said in this hall last week was true. We did try to defraud him. My wife's stories about his mental health were vicious lies, designed to isolate him and discredit him. I allowed those lies to be told. My silence was my consent. My weakness was my crime. Tears were now streaming down his face, but he did not stop. He let them fall. I failed as a son. I failed as a man. I have lost my home, my wife, and my father's respect. I deserve all of it. I am not here to ask for your pity. I am here to ask for my father's forgiveness, though I know I have not earned it. And I am here to set the record straight, because the truth is the only thing I have left to offer." He folded the paper, placed it on the lectern, and looked directly at me again. "I'm sorry, Dad." For everything, he then turned and walked back down the aisle, not stopping to speak to anyone, and exited through the side door. The church was silent for a long moment, the air thick with the weight of his confession. Then the pastor cleared his throat. "Let us pray." I didn't hear the prayer. My mind was reeling. He had done it. He had chosen the hardest path. He had subjected himself to the crucible of public shame and emerged, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, as a man of integrity. It was not a magical fix. The damage of years could not be undone in a 5-minute speech, but it was a beginning. A real, painful, and honest beginning. The epilogue of my story unfolded quietly in the months that followed. As for the antagonists, their paths diverged sharply. Jessica, stripped of her support system and her web of lies, disappeared. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved back in with her parents, the public humiliation in our small community being too much for her to bear. Her path was her own to walk. I wished her no ill, but I felt no need to know its destination. David, true to his word, began the long, arduous process of rebuilding his life from the ground up. He got a second job, moved into a tiny apartment on the far side of town, and started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Not for himself, but to understand the addiction that had so thoroughly corrupted his wife and his own judgment. He sent me a short letter every week. He didn't ask for anything. He just told me about his week, the challenges he was facing, the small victories he achieved. He was learning to live as an independent adult, a process that should have happened 20 years earlier. The house, my former home, underwent its own transformation. I finalized the donation to the Veterans Charity. They held a small ceremony, which I attended. They renamed it the Martha Miller House for Veterans, a tribute that moved me to tears. Watching a group of formerly homeless servicemen and women move into the rooms that had once been filled with resentment and strife, felt like a cleansing. The very walls seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was a symbol of hope and second chances. It was being used for a purpose far nobler than I could have ever imagined. Its history was redeemed. My own life found a new, peaceful equilibrium. I sold my old car and moved into a comfortable apartment in a retirement community with amenities and friends my own age. I was no longer a caregiver or a financial provider. I was just Frank. I volunteered at the community college, mentoring students in the accounting program that Martha's Scholarship Fund was now supporting. I found a new definition of family, not in blood, but in community and shared purpose. I was free from the emotional and financial burdens that had weighed me down for so long. I had found peace. 3 months after his public confession, I invited David to have coffee with me. We met at the same diner where I had run into my old colleague, Mark, the place where the truth had first begun to surface. He looked better. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, sober resolve. We talked for over an hour, about his jobs, about his therapy, about the things he was learning about himself. He didn't blame Jessica. He didn't make excuses. He owned his part in the disaster of his life. As we were getting ready to leave, he looked at me across the table. "Dad," he said, "I know it will take a long time to earn back your trust. Maybe I never will, but I want you to know I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." I nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile forming on my lips. "One day at a time, son." One day at a time. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not a return to the way things were, nor should it ever be. It was something new, something fragile, but real. A relationship being rebuilt on a foundation not of obligation or dependency, but of earned trust and mutual respect. I had lost a dependent child, but I had perhaps gained a man. And in the quiet dignity of my new life, I had finally, truly come home to myself. Justice, I had learned, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is simply about restoring balance, reclaiming one's peace, and allowing the truth to do its slow, inexorable, and powerful work.